Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another of our segments, the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, interviews with the movers and shakers of Cuban studies, Cuban economic analysis, and the members of the association itself. And it is my extreme pleasure for this interview to chat a little bit, and I'm just more delighted than you can imagine to chat with Rafael Romeu, who is the president and CEO of DevTech Systems, Inc. He oversees all aspects of DevTech's business operations and serves as DevTech's representative in professional forum. He holds a PhD in international finance, which is scaring the stuff out of me, because all I know are words. He holds a PhD in international finance from the Department of Economics of the University of Maryland, College Park. He joined DevTech from the International Monetary Fund, where he had worked since 2001. From 2010 on, he served in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department as the fiscal economist assigned to Spain. In this capacity, he led discussions on structural fiscal policy issues arising during the European financial crisis, and who knows, they may be on the brink of another, and developed IMF recommendations for tax measures, structural fiscal adjustment packages, entitlement and pension reforms, fiscal council's tax policy reforms, expenditure review, and fiscal federalism reform for Spain's autonomous communities, which of course remain a mess, but that wasn't Romeu's fault. Prior to the European financial crisis, Dr. Romeu worked on a number of other IMF country assignments, including Armenia, Venezuela, Uruguay, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Panama, and Cuba, among others. And I'd love to have a 4-hour interview to talk to you about the others as well, but really interesting. In addition to direct work on country assignments, he carried out IMF multilateral surveillance and research in the Research Department, the International Capital Markets Department, and the Western Hemisphere Department Regional Surveillance Unit. Now, prior to joining the IMF, he'd held position at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve and the Central Bank of Venezuela. He's been consulted by the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Department of the Treasury on economic issues relating to Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2007, he taught financial theory as a visiting lecturer at the Department of Economics at Yale. And from 2010 to 2012, he was president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, for which I bow and express my gratitude. Dr. Romeu's research is focused on fiscal policy sustainability, economic development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and financial market microstructures, which is critically important and tends to be under discussed. Dr. Romeu co-led the development of the IMF's flagship Historical Public Finances in Modern History project, which was excellent, by the way, and which documented 200 years of the history of budget deficits and government debts over the period 1800 to 2011. Of course, the most interesting part is going to be from 2011 to 2050, but that is work that awaits you in the future. Now, he's published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and several chapters in books. In 2001, he published 2 books on the emergence of retail equity trading platforms. Critically important. Thank you very much. Platforms are the future, with direct access to information on NASDAQ order books. And he is fluent in, can you guess, Spanish and Portuguese. And with that, our interview time is over. No, we've now begun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. I got a softball.
A pleasure as always, Larry. Goodbye.
I've got a softball question to start, and then we're going to really, I know you're tough, so you can handle some of these questions, but I'm going to start you off easy. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your interest in Cuba and in ASCE.
So first of all, thank you. And the work you do for the association is outstanding. So I'll take the opportunity to thank you more broadly for the great support you do with these interviews. And I'm honored to be here as part of it. I think my interest in Cuba and in ASCE is one and the same. I was born in Cuba and I came in 1980 as a small child. I was 5. And I sort of grew up in an environment that typical Cuban child grows up in, which is the family that is dumbfounded how they ended up, having to leave what their parents and grandparents had lived through, which was prosperity. Every country has its problems. No country is perfect, but I think we have fallen into a trap of either willful ignorance or outright stupidity if we think that in 1958, when the United States was operating under Jim Crow and Spain was, miserably poor after its civil war, somehow Cuba should be held to the year 2020 equality and standards of living and these sorts of issues. So there is absolutely no excuse for converting what was one of the most advanced Latin American countries at the time into what it is today, based on the conditions that were there in 1958. On January 1, 1959, you have this man who takes power and unchains a series of events that have become almost irreversible and have done permanent damage to what was a prosperous society. And that has driven a lot of my work. You could see the focus of my work is on economics and on Latin America. And it's just fascinating that we lost it, and that the institutions of a relatively prosperous society were unable to put a brake on this process, and that we fell into this. We became, if not an actor, certainly a pawn in the Cold War, and we were overtaken by historical forces that were greater than the island. And you see it to this day. We are still paying the mortgage on that decision, on that sort of collective decision that was made to move in this direction. And it happens all over the world. Countries make a wrong turn and they go down a path that is in many ways irreversible and does permanent damage. And so that's the work that I do.
And I really appreciate you highlighting an issue that tends to be overlooked in a lot of the discussion, and that is the challenge of robust and intellectually rigorous analysis. It is very easy to have ideologically driven analysis, which then inherently becomes sloppy. You apply 2020 standards to judge a country in 1959. You apply 1950 standards to judge a country in 1860, right? Those are the kinds of things, as well as the ideological objectivism of a lot of what passes for social science tends to create an environment in which much of the data that we get that are derived from what appear to be methodologically sound studies tend to be somewhat susceptible to challenge, precisely because of these underlying sloppinesses that then make the job of actually sifting through this stuff and trying to get an accurate picture, with respect to which you can make whatever judgment you want, an accurate picture going forward for analysis. So thank you very much. And I appreciate that. And in fact, it's the analysis that will drive my first big question for you. And that is, I want to turn to the question on data and data analytics, and especially in the context of Cuba. A basic issue that one encounters with developing states, and particularly, or at least traditionally with Marxist-Leninist states, is the absence of robust empirical evidence-based analysis. Now, in the case of Cuba, this takes on a special context, presenting a Caribbean expression of the development socialist version of the soft bigotry of low expectations. All right, Cuba has been something of a poster child of this challenge almost from the time of the establishment of the current political economic system. And it's hard to assess national performance, especially in countries like Cuba, in the absence of consistent and robust data that is not politically generated or politically suspect. And yet when data is understood in its political dimensions, and when data is understood primarily as a political tool, that may be extraordinarily difficult to acquire. So I was wondering if you could speak to this issue, how you get around it, can you get around it, and especially in and its consequences in the context of Cuba. And perhaps as you do that, in Cuba's comparative economic policy management performance, for example, against that of Argentina and Venezuela, and perhaps to a lesser extent, Ecuador, and then speak to the consequences. I know it's a big question, but.
Yeah, so I mean, this is in many ways what drives you know, my work and DevTech's work is you have to go at these developing countries, and you have to attack it in a serious way. It is no less serious to go in and fix a healthcare system than it is to actually operate on someone's heart. And the same scientific method that was used to develop the biology and the medical, you know, infrastructure that goes into a heart surgery, you should have underpinning your work when you're developing, you know, a vaccination program or something. You need to be equally effective. And what we see in the case of Cuba is this this incredible, and you have to really credit the Cuban regime, this incredible communications effort and this real outreach that has been incredibly effective in selling a story of David against Goliath in the United States that has washed over anything that is observable and that would respond to the scientific method. And so in many countries, and you know, there are many countries that are exactly like Cuba, many countries. One is Argentina, another one is Venezuela. And these are countries that are serial defaulters that, you know, make big, massive fiscal policy mistakes, and that typically end up socializing the cost of these mistakes through inflation onto the poor. And that is the recipe. So go in, do what you need to do. There's a lot of rent-seeking behavior at the top, and I'm being very, very sort of, I'm giving myself a lot of slack in explaining this at a very high level. You could really refine these things, but this is the recipe. Rent seekers come in, they acquire access to how a country manages its resources. These resources are misspent. In the end, they overpromise for political reasons or for whatever, and they inflate these things away. And you see it in Cuba. Cuba has invented two currencies. Cuba has the world's lowest, I think, wages. It's $20 a month, or at least certainly in the Western Hemisphere. It is just abusive, the onerous fiscal cost that has been imposed on the taxation is something akin to slavery. To work in Cuba and to earn this money and not have some support outside of from a relative, or to be getting remittances or something, is just, it's a brutal standard of living. And that analysis can be easily demonstrated through national accounts, income accounts, through poverty metrics, through just very objective, standardized reporting. And the causes of it can be explained away through very basic economic theory that says these guys spend more and made more promises than they can possibly meet because their country is you know, burdened by a political system that is maximizing its rent seeking. It is not maximizing its economic growth, and therefore there are not enough resources. You know, I'll give you a very concrete example. Venezuela's governance right now is maximizing its political control. It is not maximizing its oil production. If it maximized its oil production would not be at near zero, which is where it is today. Cuba has the same problem: zero sugar production, zero innovation, zero, you know, the best hope for a young Cuban person is to leave. That's not how one runs a country. And so this is easily demonstrable. But what happens? The David and Goliath story allows them to paper over and say, oh, we have a great healthcare system, which, by the way, is also false. And they are not covered. Because they're serial defaulters and they quit the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the early 60s. They left of their own volition. What you have is a country that is not covered by the IMF. It's not covered by the World Bank. It is not covered by any of the large sort of private sector debt, you know, creditor firms like Moody's or S&P. There is no real commercial interest in its debt. There is no significant, you know, professional economic class that is staring at it. I think the role of the association is to fill that gap. But what really the comparator to Cuba is not, for example, Dominican Republic or Mexico, it's North Korea when it comes to data. You don't know what's happening, and what they publish can be useful, and you can try to use their public data, and you could do efforts like what has happened in Argentina, which is another problem that in the you know, around the 2000s, they delinked their inflation metrics. And so you had these wonderful efforts, like MIT created the 1 Billion Prices Project to try to simulate their inflation statistics. The work that the association does for Cuba is to try to fill that gap. The work that we do at DevTech is to fill that kind of gap for these countries. It is not an insurmountable obstacle, but you have to move away from the ideological perspective and go back to first principles into the scientific method and say, what can we show? What do the data show? And it could be qualitative data, but you have to be, it doesn't just have to be national statistics. You can do surveys, you can do other things, but it has to be done rigorously, and it cannot be driven by, an ideological argument. I think regardless of ideology, whether on the left or the right, the evidence is crucial to getting it right. There's a lot of really strong, well thought through policies that could have been done in Cuba that would not have been ideological and been extremely left wing and would have been successful. Chile has been a very successful country in many ways under left wing governments and have been very strong. Today they're having some social issues, but let's say prior to 5 or 10 years ago, and they never had any problem. If one goes to Europe, there are many countries that are have much stronger state and so on. Great statistics, and they drive the conversation towards policies based on objective, reasonable evidence that can be, collected and amassed and analyzed. And you can drive any ideology. It doesn't have to be a right wing or a left wing. It could be any ideology. Can be backed by solid, reliable economic and social statistics that help you design a good, for example, transfer of income or good programs. But what they have in Cuba is an ideologically driven a discussion that ignores evidence or colors it to fit the ideology, and the world has given it a pass, and that is a problem. The world has said it's okay because of this, poor Cuba has to fight this embargo, or poor Cuba has the United States against them. And there may be valid reasons to say the US is against Cuba, and that's unfair, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they have one of the world's worst exchange rates, and they're punishing their population with low wages, and it looks exactly like Venezuela, and you shouldn't be doing these policies independent of what your trade relations are with the United States. Fiscal policy in Cuba is atrocious. Exchange rate policy in Cuba is atrocious, etc. So these have become weapons to really tax their population and to abuse the power that the governing class of Cuba has over the rest of the population to remain in power and to remain rent-seeking. There is a reason that family has remained 62 years in power.
Right. But
because that is effective.
Let me play devil's advocate, though. All right,
Sure.
Let me play devil's advocate. Because if I'm thinking about this from the perspective of economics, right, you've made a case that if it were absolutely true, all else being equal, ought to have produced collapse. And yet the opposite is true. Not that there's not the opposite in the sense that everyone is living like the head of large American multinational enterprises, but it's the system survives. And so then as an economist, which I am not, so don't mock me, but guide me if I get this all wrong. As an economist, I would say, well, wait, there's got to be, the problem isn't that it has no value or negative value. The problem is that I'm not understanding the value of it. And so here's my provocation. If that's the case, might it be useful to understand what Cuba has done, especially with respect to the David and Goliath narrative, to the political invention of the stories that are driven by their data? That is their biggest export. And that indeed what Cuba is exporting and what people are buying is the very ideology and the very ambiguity in the numbers that economists who are looking to scale and compare with other countries based on a consensus sense of the way countries ought to develop go crazy because it's not happening. So that if in fact you look at Cuba as an incredible success story, but a success story of the sale of politics or the sale of ideology, now all of a sudden you're looking at something else. And indeed, now the country looks much better. Well, it looks better. You can still fault them for not playing markets and ideology well enough to survive in better condition. And yet the value of this has to be greater than zero. And so for me, I see this, well, you're not buying and selling the ideology the way you would sugar, but you are selling it in a particular way. What was it? Last week, the Paris Club forgave debt.
Yeah.
People loan them money. And if you look at this, and so my question is, looking at this from a rigorous economic perspective, without any overlay of, oh my God, these people are just completely messed up, you have a success story here. And the success story is actually not so much the story of Cuba, but the story of the willingness of the rest of the world to effectively say one thing: oh, Cuba, you naughty, naughty, you're not playing by the rules of economics. And at the same time, turn around and be the first ones at the marketplace, either loaning the money, right, or forgiving debt, and effectively buying the ideology. And is there something perhaps to this?
No, I mean, I agree 100% with everything you're saying. I think I would phrase the part about what the role of economics is a little bit differently. I think you're 100% right. What they export is their ideology and their system and their you can almost think of a bizarre social compact that now is de facto true in Cuba, where the country says, we accept this family running our country for 62 years in exchange for what? Stability, visibility on the world stage, a country that punches way above its weight, rent-seeking benefits for an upper class in the country, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things can be enunciated. And that is not an economic question. That is a political, I think that's what you're getting at. There is a political machinery here that has dominated what would be the pocketbook issues that drive the social compact everywhere else. And that's bizarre. Why would you do that? It's closer to North Korea than it is.
But the difference is here that it's not just politics. It's politics as an object that can be sold.
Yes.
Right. That's the key thing. North Korea
and successfully exported.
Exactly right. I mean, and there, for my sense, the difference between Cuba and North Korea, for example, is that North Korea is really boxed in. They're back to where they were 600 years ago. And unless they can bend the knee to the imperial court in Beijing, they've got nothing going for the Russians first, and then the Chinese. Cuba has been able to play markets for politics, selling what they are,
right,
in way,
so yeah, they're super successful. I mean, this is what I started out with. Their communicate, that what you're describing is what I perhaps too simply and erroneously call their communications department, or their public relations is imagine if that had been put at the service of prosperity of the nation. Their ability to strike deals, and to reach markets, and to do that instead of selling this sort of tin pot ideology that we're going to help you.
Right. But the interesting thing, though, is, and for me, the curious thing is that there appears to be a fairly lucrative, I mean, it takes some amount of money to run a state. There appears to be a fairly lucrative market for politics, yes, or for political products. And that is actually fascinating.
I mean, they have a de facto colony in Venezuela. I mean, the number of healthcare and education workers that they sent down there, plus the oil, is a tremendous. I mean, this is rent seeking at its best.
But they also have a bunch of buyers, right?
Yeah.
Countries that are willing to either forgive debt or make debt, enterprises that are willing to invest, quote unquote, in the long term, even though in the short term they may not be making money. All of these are transactions
the
that
Chinese
are right. They're ostensibly economic, but they're the economics of politics, as opposed to the politics of economics. And so politics itself becomes the economic driver.
That is your widget.
Exactly right.
That is your widget.
Exactly.
And political BS going out the door.
Right. And I don't know of another country, and like you said, like Cuba, that is punching well above its weight. I mean, from their judging the value of these things through their lens, the political economic model has been wildly successful, but they're not measuring it as against the economic lives of their population. They're valuing it from the collective power that the system provides the
Exactly.
state
That's
and the state
exactly right.
apparatus.
The power of the state to project its own power. That's
Right.
the end. But
Right.
I think the role of economics, to be fair, is that the role, what I find compelling about this is that that all of their political machine is wrapped up in what I consider to be a bunch of lies. And so when you lay bare the statistics of what the living conditions are in Cuba, what their outlook is, what they've done with their currency, etc., you can begin to unravel that story behind that. Is that, it's not David against Goliath. Goliath is sitting in Havana, like, and David
Right.
is the population. And by the way, Goliath has been winning for 62 years.
Right.
So,
but as long as, and the point is, of course, that's absolutely right. But what has made how many 7, 8 administrations in the US absolutely go mad is that even if that is true, there are enough people, there is a robust enough market for what it is that they're selling that allows them, even in the face of this, that would have destroyed virtually.
Yeah, why don't they?
They
Why don't they
continue,
collapse? And
right,
they don't.
right. From their measure, they continue to prosper.
Yep.
And that creates this huge, for me, this huge dissonance in the way. So they look at the world through a lens that is so completely different from the way in which we will look at it from outside, that it doesn't compute. We see, oh my God, look at the individual, look at standard models of economics and politics.
Exactly.
This
Look at well-being, measures
not,
of well-being, measures
right,
of prosperity
right.
that you would use
Esto
in
no
Sweden.
camina. Right. Esto no camina.
Or in
right?
Taiwan or in Indonesia.
Right.
Apply those here. Don't apply.
Right. Because the measure, and that is the key here, I think.
Yeah.
The measure is different. And therefore, what for us is specious data, for them, given the founding, the organizing presumptions of their own way of looking at things, the data makes perfect sense and they are completely robust.
Yeah.
And so there's no way to. And
in fact, the data is at their service. So it's one more weapon that they have to communicate their goals and their, and they're actually very good at producing certain kinds of social development indicators and working backwards to score highly on, things like, the mortality of infants, infant mortality rates, and these sorts of things. They know how to manage their healthcare system and manage the recording of their statistics so that you get a wonderful result. And all of that kicks in at all levels, at education and health and all of those. But the reality on the ground, if you went in, it would not be, this is not comparable to conditions even in Latin America. Okay. So,
well, let me ask you on that. So as you were talking, I'm thinking, wow, okay, that makes sense. But then how do you place, given that analysis, where do you place the much vaunted Cuban, Cuba's 2030 economic plan, the much vaunted pharma sector, which Cuba says actually shows the country at its entrepreneurial and innovative best? That in fact, they've developed all these drugs. They're in partnerships with the Chinese with the COVID and COVID-related treatments, with the Spanish with respect to, the diabetes drugs and the like, and that indeed you can't talk about the economic situation in Cuba as being completely flat. In fact, there are areas where they're acting like a first world country, and that it's just a matter of time before they start bringing in a lot of money.
Yes, I mean, so we looked at that, and it's just not there. They don't have. They do have small joint ventures here and there on biological production and things, and these are not uncommon. Puerto Rico has the same industry. Brazil has a great pharma. If you have a fairly well-educated population, it doesn't have to be the whole population. It could be a segment of it. You can set up these operations. The issue is that they don't, for Cuba, they don't move the needle. They're important as show horses, but You're not. It's not moving the needle. It's not big enough. It'd be like saying in the United States, we're all in the movie industry. The movie industry is important, and by the way, their biological production is nowhere near the movie industry of the U.S. So I'm just giving a clear example. The movie industry is globally successful in a way that the biological production and the biopharma industry in Cuba is not. But even setting that difference aside, none of us work in the movie industry, and so it's great that that's there. But we need to create jobs for 330 million Americans, and it's a very small, thin, and privileged slice that gets to make movies. The rest of us have to duke it out with the actual labor market and try to make a living in other ways.
Okay. All right. All right. Let me turn, if I can now, to the issue of the embargo, right? The economics of the embargo. And I understand that, of course, this is a theme that's been developed nicely. And what I want to touch on is a theme that's been developed nicely by your partner and another former ASCE president, Jorge Sanguinetti. All right, we're all very well versed in the complexity of the US embargo, and outsider embargoes generally is a tool of, and outsider embargoes like that generally is a tool of international relations. But Jorge points out something else, and something actually quite interesting that I hope that we can talk about right now. And that is the issue of internal embargoes, right? Not the external embargo, the internal embargo. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what it is and how it works and how it affects Cuba's economic development.
So Jorge, or Dr. Jorge Sanguinetti, who was the founder of DevTech, he was, his history, and you'll probably talk to him at some point. His history is incredibly complex and rich in understanding of these phenomenon. He and I come at the same problem from two different directions. My outsider view is why is Cuba treated differently? Why can't we just look at the numbers and say that the pocketbook issues that affect every voter in Latin America seem to be forgotten when it comes to Cuba because of everything we just discussed? Jorge comes at it from an institutional perspective, and he's someone who has extensive experience. He's also an economist just like me, but he worked inside Cuba in the Ministry of Planning in the early days of the revolution, knows the system and so on. And the insight that he brings is that there is an external embargo. There are these, very difficult trade relations. By the way, the embargo is not an embargo. It's full of holes. And Cuba has the single largest source of tourists, for example, to Cuba is Americans that they call Cuban residents abroad. So, people who live in Miami who go visit their families, et cetera. It's exactly the same as, I think, after the Canadians. I should caveat that the Canadians are a massive industrial base for Cuba in terms of tourists, but right nipping at their heels is Cubans living abroad, and the lion's share of those are in the United States. They trade in agriculture. They trade in several things. So this embargo idea is more public relations than it is a reality. That said, Jorge has made this point before, and this is absolutely, blank from the public discourse and from the public consciousness when it comes to Cuba, is that their own internal set of regulations are so brutal that it would, if you remove the embargo tomorrow, be 100 times worse than any trade relief you would get. And so the marginal tax rate for labor, for example, in Cuba can go above 95% if you have too many employees. That's ridiculous. The number of inspections that you have, I've been, as you mentioned before, I've been to Cuba on a number of occasions in the early 2010s. Just for taxis, they have like 7 different inspectors. And the reason all of these things happen, there is no private sector. There is no country in the world that has made private sector activity illegal. And that has nothing to do with the bilateral trade relation of the United States. That has to do with an ideology sitting, in the government, that at the highest levels of government, that prioritizes control at the expense of economic development, because as people grow more financially and economically robust, and they're more resilient, and they can amass wealth, and they can withstand shocks, they no longer need the government to withstand the shocks for them. And then they become more independent, and that leads to more instability from the perspective of the government. If they depend on us, we control them. If they become economically independent, they're more difficult to control. And so it's very much a war economy, a rationing economy, an economy of we'll release the valves and let you do a little bit of economic activity. And it's written into the law. That this is not a secret. This is not something that I'm making up, or here comes this right winger. In Cuba, to give a very simple example, if you have one employee, your tax rate is X. I'm not going to go into the numbers because it's going to bore everyone. If you have 2 employees, it's X plus a positive number. If you have 3 employees, it's more than 2. So your tax rate goes up, not based on how much you made, but based on the number of employees you have, the head count. This is a very bizarre way of tax. Why would you tax labor? Why would you tax the job creation? The reason you would do that is because you're amassing, it's their way of controlling and sort of easily controlling some measures of revenue and of income in the firm, and who is managing this resource base that they don't have access to, because it's not a government. This would be in a restaurant or in a bar or some private sector entity. And so they want it to be small. They want it to be a small family thing that allows you to exist. But if you go too far, if you start franchising, now we don't know what you're doing. And that is ingrained into every single, the collectives, the agricultural efforts. Okay, you can have a collective farm, but we sell you the tools and we buy your products. Or you can have, it's really fascinating, because we've seen this in Asia, in China, in Vietnam. Agriculture is the home of capitalism. Farmers are the most entrepreneurial people in the world. They are people who, plant, they borrow to plant and to manage, and 6 months later they reap the harvest. They are gambling the whole way. These are people who really take their future into their hands and pull it right out of the ground and sell it. And when you see these releases in Vietnam or in China of the agricultural sector, you just really see them take off. In Cuba, they probably read about that and said, we're not doing it. And so that is the internal embargo. That is the set of institutions that Jorge has pointed to and said, let's have a discussion about the embargo. Let's talk about the embargo between the US and Cuba. And let's talk about the internal embargo and how much stronger that is, how it is literally illegal. It is illegal for you to sell an ice cream on the corner, or at least it was in 1960s. Now, not so much. Perhaps they've given a license here and there, but they're going to heavily regulate you. And the process between back then and now has been one of a very slow, steady, and often one step forward, 2 steps back, liberation. This has not come. The normal process that you see in Vietnam, in China, the socialist reformations that allow socialist governments to remain in power, but allow people to do economic activity well beyond what's allowed in Cuba, is evidence of that internal embargo. So Cuba can be a socialist country. It can be left, extreme left, like China or Vietnam or Cambodia, but it doesn't have to have this internal embargo. And that discussion is what I think Jorge has driven and said, why is this so bad? And why are we so focused on the fact that you can't buy a Coke from the US? Although, by the way, you can buy it from Mexico. And in the meantime, you're not allowed to have an ice cream stand. Like in China or in Vietnam, that would be a trivial, of course it's allowed. Why do you care?
Not without the appropriate license, the appropriate approvals at the local, regional, and depending on how big the ice cream stand is, the state council, right? Sure. As long as you include your plan, which includes the marketing. I actually read through the 60 pages of regulations.
We should warn the listeners that Larry is the wrong person to bring up China with, because he's a he will talk you through the Chinese system from A to Z. So, but I mean, you can point to examples like agriculture. China has done great strides in agriculture. Cuba can't plant a tomato, and that's due to the internal embargo. And these are 2 socialist countries. They have shared ideologies. They have shared socialist goals. They're very similar. One emulates the other, and yet no agriculture in Cuba.
Now, one of the most interesting things about this notion of internal embargo and basically the notion that you create this enormous state apparatus, the purpose of which is to control all the way down in the most granular way all economic activity, effectively substitute this administrative apparatus for the market, because they're very suspicious of the market, that this applies not just internally within the construction of the non-state sector, but it is also a hallmark of Cuba's external relations with its partners. And so, for example, what I've seen, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit, Malia comes in. Malia wants to build a hotel somewhere in Cuba. They found a new tourist site. Malia can't go into the country. Malia can come to the shores of the country. And at that point, they have a buffer, a cordon sanitaire. Their dealings are with the state apparatus, in this case, the military for the most part, because they're doing a hotel. Their labor is provided by the state. The approvals, including business plans, financing, money transactions, cash flows, all have to be reviewed and approved by various levels. And as Malia, it's going to be approved in Havana rather than by the local folks. And in the process, there is absolutely no ability for an outside company to actually engage with the productive forces inside of Cuba. They deal with the state. So effectively what the Cubans have done, if you look at their foreign investment, is to create a wall, including that wall, which is the 90 square kilometers of Mariel, a wall you can walk to it. But from there internally, you require both the guidance and the assistance of the state. You can't do it themselves. And in a sense, that creates this notion of internal embargo, not just within Cuba and its own people, but with respect to the way Cuba views the ability of non-Cubans, of non-Cuban capital to flow in. And in fact, you can't flow in, you can only flow to. And that may also have a significant effect on their ability to develop any kind of macroeconomic policy that is robust internally.
Yeah, I think your comment is super insightful, because if you look at so this is what I spoke to was Cuba regulating its domestic economy, but it also has an external element that invests in its economy, especially, as you said, in tourism. In Mariel, they have some mining, joint ventures, et cetera, and nickel and whatnot. Basically, firms are labor, capital, and productivity. Productivity, we can't speak to. Labor and capital, you have to pay for. The capital has to be funded from the outside. Otherwise, why are you investing? So they deeply, deeply regulate the income of the capital. As you mentioned, the documents, we own 51%. And by me, I mean the military, et cetera, et cetera. And then they do generally make a deal where you recoup that capital very quickly, I think in the first 5 years.
Yeah.
However, they have a currency issue, and they may put a cap on how much currency you could take out of the country at any given time, especially when times are tough, and they've, which is what I started out with, defaulted on all of their promises, and now they're printing, they have the bad peso, which is monopoly money, and then they have the quote unquote good peso, which is supposed to be, a parity with the dollar. This thing is also bad now. And so when they run out of funny money, they don't let you take your money out. And that's true for foreign investors, anybody. And so they need to put a cork on this currency loss, like every other country in Latin America. And this is why it's so useful to have compared. They are no different than anyone else, except they're over here and they're doing. So that's how they manage their capital. You bring the money, we'll write a bunch of onerous conditions where essentially you become a collaborator with this communist regime that is working. I mean, this is really what these foreign investors are doing, which is it's fine. A lot of people invest in communist countries. Look at China. I'm not placing a moral judgment. I'm just saying they are collaborating 100% in these investment vehicles. And then comes the labor part. And the labor part is even worse because they hire Bob or let's call him Roberto, and Roberto comes to work and Roberto is paid $10 an hour, that goes to the Cuban government, and then the Cuban government pays Roberto 10 pesos an hour, which when you divide by 20 becomes 50 cents. So Roberto is getting 1/20th of whatever his salary was, unless they can strike an exchange rate, which they never do. And then maybe the firm turns around and then gives Roberto a tip or a gratuity or some other way to pay him, or it's a tourism-based industry, so Roberto makes money off the tips of the tourists, or there is some compensating differential that makes Roberto have one of the best jobs in Cuba because the other people are also making 50 cents an hour instead of $10, except they're working in the glue factory in the middle of Havana that has the conditions that it has. So Roberto is hitting a tourism venue, and he is in a differentiated kind of indentured servant contract where the foreign company pays the government of Cuba, and the government of Cuba turns around and pays its own worker. This is, and you are the legal expert, but this is highly reminiscent of regimes with workers in historical times. And I don't want to be too incendiary and mention the most egregious examples of this, but it is.
But you don't have to go that far. I mean, in a sense, we can talk about this in a much more benign sense. It is an incredibly aggressive temporary
Taxation.
labor agency. It's a temporary labor agency.
Yeah.
The way you have in South Asia, for example. Exactly. So I go and I get 20 people together, and I can provide temporary labor, which is essentially what they're doing. They're providing temporary labor to Malia. I will charge you for the provision of temporary labor. The difference is, of course, that because they are my workers, I also get to pay them, as opposed to a more traditional structure where I get a fee for the provision of the labor, and I have some rights to an additional fee if you hire them permanently, but that ultimately you're going to pay them directly. Here, the difference is really one of degree. So what they've done is they have become the sole labor agency, the sole
they're a monopsonist in labor.
Right, but it also distorts the real labor costs, or the real labor pricing, because Roberto gets 10 Cuban dollars. The Cuban state gets 10 real dollars, but from Roberto's perspective, he's getting 10 Cuban dollars plus the tips. And indeed, as part of Cuban policy is to do precisely that. You're going to set your labor costs. The government is going to set their labor costs to Malia, counting on the fact that they can, with some degree of accuracy, predict roughly how much tip they're going to get. And so again, who's actually paying who's actually paying wages for the folks in the tourist industry? It's going to be the people who are also renting rooms from Malia Hotel. And it may be Malia itself in the form of these like Christmas bonuses or the like, but it'll be la propina. You get a cook here, you don't do cooks anymore, you get a peso here, you get a peso there, and all of a sudden it adds up in Cuba into real money. And so in effect, you've got a very odd wage labor market set up, but one in which the state sitting in the middle recoups a substantial amount of the money actually flowing.
And you could even go simpler and say this is a labor rate. This is a taxation scheme on labor that is setting the rate. If you knew how much the tips, you could figure it out. Maybe but if the tips were 0, it would be 95%. Right. Because we can somehow assume that there's tips, maybe it's 80% or 85% is the marginal tax rate on labor, or actually the average tax. And so this is again, if we had the right numbers, you could say, okay, what's the tax rate on labor everywhere else? How are we doing relative?
Right.
And that's a sort of question that we should have. But because it's done in a way in which, well, we've got two currencies and we pay them in one, we pay them in the other. We don't know how much the tips are. Nobody reports, et cetera, et cetera. There's evasion. There's no transparency around these numbers. And it is no doubt a brutal taxation regime on labor, but it's a discussion that is overtaken by the discussion of why don't Americans travel to Cuba or something.
Well,
like
that's right. But
yeah.
actually, now I'm going to play real devil's advocate here for a second. You've made me really curious. If all of this is true, and I were the Cuban state, there would be no reason especially in the context of a tip-driven sector, there's no reason why I could not set the wages that I actually pay my workers at zero and say, I am charging Malia 10 euros an hour for your wages. I will pay, but I'm going to construe that as my service fee for giving you access to tips. Your salary is going to be whatever you can hustle in the form of tips. And now my quote unquote tax rate for wages is 100%. In return for which I give you security, protection from the American imperialists, health care, and whatever else the state, housing, whatever else the state can use to justify. But there's no reason why in a system like this, wages, the amount of money actually given to the workers can't go down to zero.
I mean, I guess it could, and there's no, I think you would have to think through whether that applies to every job, whether there are some that depend on some sort of wage differentiation. So, you know, if the firm doesn't have a way of paying the person more or less, they may incorporate that into their incentive structure and try to hide money into tips and away from the Cuban government's sort of tax base. I don't know if it's illegal in Cuba to tax at 100%. They do, so there may be a statutory reason why they have to pay, the person has to have a wage even within their socialist system. However, what I would say in support of your question is the difference between 5% and between 95 and 100% is almost meaningless. Okay. So they're not at zero, but they're almost there. And I think they have thought it through. I mean, the exchange, it is really remarkable to have an exchange rate, a dual exchange rate where one is 1-to-1 and the other is 25-to-1 or 20-to-1 on a good day. So that it's a bipolar distribution. You don't have, you bimodal. You don't have, you know, you have the haves and the have-nots. This is not an effort to find an equilibrium. This is an effort to differentiate people and say, if you get access to 1-to-1, you're a winner. And if you don't, good luck in life. It's not too different from zero.
Well, it's not so much good luck, is you're thrown out of the formal economy, as are many, many Cubans, and you're thrown into vamos resolver economy. It's barter. We're back, right? We're back to a pre-monetary economy where everything is based on bartering.
And that makes it easier to control because it's harder, you know, it's harder to find. You can't trade in markets. You don't have a store of value. You don't have a unit of account. You can't just call somebody and say, you know, if I'm selling pork, you're buying it because the day that I need you'll need pork, I'll be there for you, and that kind of thing. I mean, all these informal economies that inhibits any sort of you know, wealth accumulation or anything like that. So
right, which again goes back to your point in that from the Cuban perspective is actually a positive. As long as people are resolviendo and they're not starving, and we give them the basics, right? The basics in terms of ration food, in terms of ration healthcare, in terms of all of that stuff. We got everyone where we want them for the purpose of assessing the success of the political economic model that we have created. From the perspective of outsiders, we faint. We go, oh my God, this thing
they manage expectations that way. The political expectations of the system are, as far as I can tell, if I can solve my problem for food and whatnot reliably, but not comfortably, but reliably, this is success. That's a successful person in Cuba, somebody with air conditioner and food.
It's a successful person, and the state itself judges itself successful, right? Because now what it has done is it's kept everyone at a particular, it has advanced a core item or core good that for the state is probably valued very highly, and that is stability.
Exactly, exactly. Stability, their story on healthcare and their international footprint, their ability to project power,
Right.
the pride, the national independence
Right.
pride, all of
All of
these
which are
stories.
right, but all of which are economic goods that ought to be measurable. We ought to be able to put a dollar value on those.
Yeah, and we
We
can.
may disagree because for us, the value is zero, but for them, it's got a significant positive value that pays off. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as the opportunity cost is the value, and what they have sacrificed in terms of
Ah,
prosperity is so big, is so big that this is really, that gets back to the question of the social compact for the nation of Cuba. It is a sacrifice that collectively they have made, and I wonder if that's a rational choice or if it has been released so piecemeal and uh, so carefully orchestrated that that question has never been brought in there's no election that says, do you want more of this or do you want to move in the direction of, oh, I don't know, Mexico? Like,
well, actually, there was a series of speeches that Fidel made between 1985 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which he came as close as I've ever seen him come. And I haven't read all of them. There's like, it will take 2 lifetimes.
yeah.
But these I've read, and I've read these carefully, that suggest that indeed that choice was quite deliberately made on the grounds that the way in which Western economists measure prosperity, including individual prosperity in market systems, is itself ideologically corrupt, and that the consumer culture it generates, a culture that chases goods and things, is a false construct that must be avoided by creating a system of social discipline and, as exactly as you suggested, of managed expectations down to a reasonable level. There is a passage which for me was it's not a famous passage, but it really struck with me. Fidel goes on for about a page discussing a refrigerator, right? The West will give you, and this is a paraphrase, the West will give you refrigerators, big ones, little ones, with all of these different colors, with all of these gadgets in, and they make you work hard to strive to take the one that has more of the stuff because it costs more money. And then they'll make you throw it away because they've got a new model that comes in. But why do you need all of this stuff when you can have a box, a standard box that puts out cold air? That is the sign of success, not the striving for the beautiful gold leaf refrigerator that sings and dances for you, right? And it was that kind of analogy and that kind of discussion back in the heydays before they even thought it possible for the Soviet Union to.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that was always their story. That was always their story.
Boom.
Less
And
is
they
more
had,
because of all of these social goods that we provide and the chess club and the Casa de la Música and all of that.
and they had, again, it takes more than 2 to tango. This dovetailed in very nicely with the anti-consumer culture that was coming out, for example, from the Vatican in the 80s and 90s. And so you use it. Now, they didn't mean it the same way, of course,
Yeah.
but you use this. And so there's this extraordinary thing. And at the end of the day, economists, Western economists, even Chinese and Vietnamese economies will scratch their heads and go, we don't understand, right? But for them, they view the world from such a different starting point that what we say here just doesn't compute in the way that what we see going on there doesn't compute either. It's inexplicable.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's fair to say that in the United States, because there's going to be people who hear this and say, wow, he was right. Look at all the consumer choice that we have and what has it brought us, and we're not as happy. I think the important question that I have is that and I wonder, you should correct me. The issue is that he made that speech, but nobody asked him to. So it's great that he has that view, but that view has never been tested. I mean, he just imposed that view. And so he made the choice for the guy who said, I'm going to choose a yardstick that makes what I'm doing look successful. And as a result of me choosing that yardstick on behalf of you, your family, your future generations, the ability for you to prosper or not, to have that refrigerator or not, because I chose this yardstick, I now reveal to you that the refrigerator you have, which is atrocious, is the right choice.
Right.
Because,
That's right. And even
I've
the Marxist,
imposed that.
right. And even the Marxist Leninists will scratch their heads on this, because it's not just that that choice was made, but that choice was made among a number of variations that were available in Marxist Leninism as well. And so there the question is, well, okay, why did he make the choice? He made the choice, he'll say, because he is the first secretary of the Communist Party and the political economic system is guided by this vanguard party. And yet, even within vanguard party systems, they'll look at this choice and say, but wait a minute, this isn't the inevitable choice with respect to consumer goods.
Yeah.
What is your basis for making this choice, even within strict Marxist-Leninist theory? The Vietnamese and the Chinese took a very different path.
Exactly. I mean, that's
Right.
Exhibit A. I mean, they should always go back and compare. I find it compelling to compare with China and Vietnam. And in fact, I have a paper in ASCE about that, because they are so they're just so diametrically opposed on certain key issues, and yet they're allies and
Yeah.
everybody's together. But
Yes.
I don't know how a Chinese would explain Cuba, because he would just scratch, maybe he would scratch his head, the Chinese Marxist Leninist economist, and say, why haven't you moved on agriculture? What is your insecurity on letting farmers grow food?
And that's where the Americans, Cuba's best friend,
Yeah.
because the explanation will be the unrelenting enmity of the United States. This is now, this is almost in quotes. The unrelenting enmity of the United States creates a national context in which choices like this may be rational. That would be the explanation.
Including not having food grown domestically. I mean, yeah, no, I think this has been, again, I think we agree their success has been developing this narrative, and I'm not a big fan of the word narrative, because it seems to project varying interpretations of the truth, when there should be
Yeah,
one scientific method.
but narrative is a commodity, and it's got value, and you can buy it and sell it, and there are markets for it. So and there you go.
They are the best. I think they are head and shoulders the best globally at producing this.
Right. Now, I'm afraid that I'm almost at the point of exhausting you, but I wanted to, before we finish up, I wanted to touch a little bit on DevTech's work with USAID. And I was wondering, I understand that this work can be delicate. We're dealing with the government, especially in the context of capacity building, of monitoring, and of analytics, which is my interest in your work as opposed to anything else. So it's in that context, I was wondering if maybe you can speak a little bit to the way that DevTech pairs its methodological capabilities in economics, data analytics, finance, and social sciences with technological solutions in developing and designing projects, in implementing and carrying out performance monitoring, evaluation, and in the way in which it contributes to sustainable and lasting solution to policy challenges. Because this has significant ramifications, not just in the context of Cuba and not just in the context of American policy, but really in a broad range of contexts, from corporate social responsibility and responsible business conduct to the way in which states, either Marxist, Leninist, or liberal democratic, will approach macroeconomic policy. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So basically, when you look at foreign assistance, it's USAID, which is our principal client in the firm. The reason we love that work and that agency and that it's successful is because we get to go out and be, internationally focused on helping really where the marginal taxpayer dollar helps them. Like if you go into South Sudan and you help that person who is, a survivor of a conflict and it has just the world's most difficult conditions on the ground, that is really the highest marginal value you can get. And it is also a pillar of the national defense. That person will then is less likely to be a terrorist down the road, is less likely to attack. So foreign assistance is a beautiful field, but it's not a field. It is not an industry. It is not a sector of the government that has a natural constituency inside the US. So there is no You know, as we've said, we've conversed in the past, you and I, uh, there's no family whose son or daughter will be kicked out of the school band because you cut the budget at USAID. There is no road in Tennessee that is not built because you cut the budget of USAID. And so that agency has had to work very, very hard and has been raked over the coals by successive Congresses as to what are you doing with our money? How is it effective? Are you getting value for the taxpayer? And they've developed a great expertise over 30 years in measuring in metrics. They use quantitative, and they're in very complex environments, and they use qualitative. And you see them strive. It is in their management. It is in their policy bureaus. It is in their management bureaus that every effort has to be paired with how are we measuring our success? How are we measuring our success in intermediate steps? How do we get from point A to point B? What are the steps you need? What do we expect to see? What are your inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact? And what do we expect to see long term? What are the units of measure? I mean, it is ingrained in their DNA because they are defending the budgets, and I think it is quite a burden that has been placed on them because they are part of the national defense. They are critical. You can go into a country and help people who are in need and teach them, with an education program, or help their girls be more, more modern in their roles in society. Or you can wait 20 years and then you have a situation where you have an insurgent population and you have to go in with the Defense Department. And in fact, I think the evidence of the very strong, robust philosophy and program that USAID has embraced over its existence to drive both qualitative and quantitative metrics around what works, why, learning, organizational learning is like, hey, this worked, let's scale it up. This is in their DNA. It is a very attractive part of the work that we do at DevTech. It's now being emulated by the Department of Defense. It's now being emulated. I mean, some of these other agencies, DoD being one of them, has been tasked, with a 20-year war. These are fighters. These are people who go out and they fight, and they come back to base, and they did their job. Over 20 years, you're not making progress by just fighting. So they've begun to say, how do we some of the nation building tasks that we have, some of the tasks, the humanitarian assistance tasks, let's embrace some of this metrics around programming that foreign assistance has played all of their lives. The Department of State is another one who is really leading in adapting some of these evaluation and metrics-based measures of success that USAID has really led on, and that the Millennium Challenge Corporation obviously leads on. We now have a new agency called the Development Finance Corporation. I'll give you an example. The health supply chain, the U.S. has a landmark program called PEPFAR, where they supply metrics around, they supply what's called the antiretroviral therapy, the ART cascade. So they're supplying people with drugs that help them combat AIDS and tuberculosis, and they do a lot of testing and a lot of training and try to do preventive measures. This is a massive supply chain problem. When you're talking about, at the peak, it was, I think, $9 billion a year. The kind of metrics that you need around that is exactly the work that DevTech loves to do. This thing was designed from the start. How do we run a pharmaceutical operation globally in 50 countries? How do we make it work? It's truly fascinating, and it really speaks to the sorts of things that I think I've embraced my entire career, which is, measure what you want to do. Go back to first principles. How are we going to get this done? And what's been missing in a lot of the discourse in Cuba, which is, a lot of ideology and very little, or let's say what's been missing in the traditional sense in Cuba. They're measuring other things, as we've discussed, but that sort of technique that happens on supply chain, that happens on every program at USAID, is what I think the rest of the U.S. government is embracing from the development sector, and what has drawn DevTech to this work for 4 decades almost. We're in our 36th year of operation. So I think that's really that's what we like, is the very high standard for accountability and results, and the work that goes into that in terms of measuring and understanding and learning and what works and how to scale it up.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm sitting and listening to you and thinking, oh my God, this has so much application, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well, in terms of the way in which a multinational enterprise, for example, has to develop sensitivities down its supply chain or its production chain, in terms in which it meets its emerging responsibilities, not just with respect to human rights and human rights issues, but sustainability. Right. And so a lot of companies that we've been looking at, for example, now are faced with dealing with these issues in the context of embedding the sustainability development goals. And what you folks do at DevTech has extraordinary applications in those areas as well. It's at some point, I'm hoping that you will be able to coordinate this, not just from USAID, but out into the private sector as well, as it expands out globally through its production chain.
And frankly, that is a huge focus of development today, is to embrace a lot of the money that leaves the United States, the vast majority of even foreign assistance, but obviously of the broad balance of payments is the private sector. And so the US government foots the world's largest tab in foreign assistance, but the majority of money that is flowing around the world, foreign assistance is a very, very small part. So you really do want to put these sorts of metrics around, what are you achieving when you go into a country? Is it environmentally sustainable? Is it? And USAID has led on a number of these issues. I remember in the late 90s, they were thinking about gender in a very serious way, and they developed it over a decade. And today we are embracing the very important role of gender and of lifting up women and girls to make countries really peaceful, sustainable, modernize workforces, grow economically, sustain, true democratic reforms, transparency. All of those things are greatly helped by empowering women and girls. USAID was doing that in the late 90s and really led the way in many, and I don't mean this was the first time they thought of it. I mean, they put a lot of money into it. And drove it and wrote it into their policy document that every single project had to have a gender component to it. And you had to speak to, what are you doing to incorporate gender into your work? They are now doing exactly that. And they've done it for about a decade on metrics and learning and driving every single project to say, how are you measuring it? What is the impact? Here are the 11 indicators that we have. Show me how you map into it. And then learning, organization. You have a massive organization with, dozens and dozens of offices around the world. How do you learn as an organization? This is hugely important. How do you take a success that happened in Botswana and scale it up to Honduras? Do we know? Is it really a success? Was it idiosyncratic? Maybe it had nothing to do. We have to have ways of starting out with a baseline, of getting results, of having peer review within the organization, of pushing back if things don't work. This is the true sort of high standard of accountability that USAID has set for itself, and that I think has been really, among other agencies that also do this, an example towards the broader federal space and maybe towards the private sector to say, go in and say what you're going to achieve, and then measure and report back.
Right.
And see if it worked, and then let's learn.
And that's the kind of capacity, of course, that requires the sort of production of wealth that countries, especially developing countries and countries that have taken the path of Cuba, may find much, much more challenging. And so you've got a lot of collateral effects. As you were talking, I was thinking, oh my God, that's one of the big collateral effects of the path, for example, that Cuba may have taken, the inability to actually be able to draw on the resources necessary, to divert the resources necessary to do the kind of work, the kind of metrics and analytics, the kind of accountability structures that are fairly targeted, that are necessary if you're going to have a complex and robust multi-sectoral approach to development, even development along either Marxist-Leninist, socialist, or liberal democratic lines. So just, fascinating.
Yeah, the resource constraint, and also the ability to honestly assess and say, we failed, let's learn from it, and let's adjust. There are probably many examples of failure in Cuba that have never been acknowledged openly. You know, I don't know if you know that this, when they started, I've always been told the story as a child. We can end on this. It's a kind of a humorous story of at some point Fidel had decided to bring in cows, and we should really ask someone who is much older than you or I to bring in cows from Canada. So apparently Cuba had good beef cows and Canada got good dairy cows. And so, you know, Fidel, being who he is, said, let's get the best of both worlds and bring in some of these bulls from Canada. And then we're going to have good beef cows that also give great milk. And yeah, the typical sort of, you know, leadership from the top that determines and micromanages and basically destroys. So he brings in this cow. And my understanding is this story is true, that there was a bull. It was a prized bull, very expensive. And so they kept it in air-conditioned pen in Cuba. So you could just imagine how the Cubans accepted the existence of this bull whose name was Rosafe. And my understanding is that Rosafe woke up one day having swallowed a chain, dead.
Oh, God.
So somebody fed Rosafe a chain, because you know, they were like, why are we feeding and housing and air conditioning this bull? This is outrageous. And that was, I think, a good example of an opportunity to take stock of the cow fertilization program that Fidel had designed and think through whether this was a great idea. But I don't know that you know, and that's a kind of an amusing, it's sad for the poor animal, but it's just incredible that this is how that, you know, how the system responded to this and this is an urban legend, so I don't know,
Right.
if
Yeah.
it's
No,
maybe it's a
but
little bit of exaggeration there. Who
yeah,
knows?
but the Apocrypha is right. I mean, the notion that, in fact, in systems that lack accountability, then you've got all kinds of events that occur that are wasteful, and doubly wasteful, not just
Yes,
in and of itself, but because they fail to provide the lessons necessary to avoid it or something worse the next time around.
exactly. There's no accountability, there's no checks and balances, and there's no learning from what didn't
Right,
work.
right, and that's a critical thing. So, any last words?
Well, thank you. No, thank you so much. This is very fascinating. I love talking with you because your you know, your perspective is magnificent. So
My
I'm very grateful.
No, and I am too. I am on behalf of ASCE and on behalf of myself personally, thank you so much for taking the time to have what for me was just an absolutely brilliant discussion. I really appreciate your time, and I hope our listeners will as well.
All
So
right. Thank
thank
you
you
so
again.
much. Thank you.
All right.
Take care.